Welcome to another lecture of Psychology 101. I'm your instructor, Dr. Shadi Bashai, and in today's lecture, we will discuss the psychology of personality. And we will be discussing the first section of that unit on personality, which corresponds to chapter 14 of your textbook. So here we go. Take a second to reflect on this. If I asked a few of your closest friends or family members to describe you, what would they say? Some of you might be described as shy, for example. Others as outgoing. Maybe others yet as friendly. Maybe some as suspicious. All of these terms are used to describe people's personality. And what is personality? Personality is the characteristic way someone behaves, feels, and thinks. When we talk about personality, we're also talking about something that is pretty stable across time and across different situations. We don't tend to count transient states, if you will, as a part of personality. So for it to be considered a part of our personality, it has to be shown across time and across different situations. Over the years, there have been two distinct approaches to study personality. The nomothetic approach is concerned with understanding averages and population means, if you will. That is, the nomothetic approach is about understanding the laws, so the overall laws that govern human personality. So this is it's a generalist type of movement or approach. Your textbook's approach, as well as my own, will mostly live in this nomothetic or generalist approach. However, there is another way to understand or to study personality, and that's the idiographic approach. The idiographic approach is concerned with understanding idiosyncrasies and pretty much unique aspects of people's individual personalities. So it's the deep dive, if you will, to understanding people, and for that reason, it's less concerned with averages and more concerned with individual level characteristics. For this reason, the idiographic approach relies less on big aggregate level quantitative data, and more on case study methodologies. So where do we get our personality from? The field of behavioral and genetic studies over the past few decades has, both of which have given us a few insights about the relative contribution of three distinct factors in determining our personalities. The first factor we have to consider is, of course, genetics, or the genotype or genetic blueprint which we possess or we are born with. Secondly, or the second factor that we have to consider in thinking about where we get our personality, we have to understand the role of environment. And the factor of environment can actually be broken down further into two distinct factors. So there's the first environmental factor we call shared environmental factors. And then the second factor is called non-shared environmental influences or factors. So shared environmental influences are any influences that are shared by genetically related people. For example, a neighborhood and someone's socioeconomic status, for example, are both variables related to shared environments if we're examining two siblings, since obviously they grow up in the same home, in the same neighborhood. Finally, there is non-shared environmental influences, which are unique environmental influences impacting two genetically related people. So I'll give you an example of what that might look like. Let's say one of two siblings had a very close friendship during adolescence that protected them from getting social anxiety, for example, while the other sibling, who shares the same gene for developing social anxiety, so one develops the condition and the other doesn't, because of that close friend. So the non-shared environmental factor acts as a protective mechanism against some genes that may not otherwise actually develop. So we get much of this information regarding genetic and environmental influences on personality from two types of studies called twin and adoption studies. And I challenge you to stop this video and watch the embedded YouTube clip. It's a fun little video about the power of genes in influencing personality and personal preferences. Sometimes genes work through the environment. That is, it's a concept we call gene-environment interaction. We find that a certain genetic blueprint, for example, makes people pick certain environments, and when these environments are chosen, they may actually be associated with the gene expressing even more. So the gene influences which environments people pick, and then once these environments are in fact chosen and people reside in these environments, the gene expresses even more within such environments. So before we dive into genetic influences on personality, let's take heed of the following. We cannot genetically localize personality. That is, there is no specific gene for specific behaviors. Even more specifically, genes influence behaviors indirectly. And the mechanism here is genes code for proteins, and then these proteins influence neurotransmitter action in the brain, which in turn are then associated with likelihood to engage in certain behaviors and likelihood to inhibit from certain behaviors. As with anything, of course, environment can actually influence the level of expression of certain genes and even make the effects of certain genes more pronounced. That is, there is a dynamic and very complicated relationship that's at play between nature and nurture and their influences on personality. One of the things that twin and adoption studies have taught us is that the correlation or the relationship between nature and personality traits is not perfect. That is, the correlations are all well under the perfect correlation coefficient of 1, which signifies, of course, a perfect association between two variables. So this gives us an indication that our environment, or nurture, if you will, is also partly responsible for shaping our personality. So both genes, nature, and environment, nurture, work together, each contributing to our personality as we develop. Take a minute to look at the following table, which summarizes correlations of personality traits of identical twins, which we call monozygotic twins. So identical or monozygotic twins share 100% of their genetic blueprint. And the table also has information on fraternal twins, or what we call dizygotic twins, and fraternal or dizygotic twins or dizygotic twins, they share about 50% of their genes, so no different than any two ordinary siblings, if you will, in terms of their genetic overlap. And so this table summarizes personality traits of identical and fraternal twins, and these estimates are actually shown for both types of twins in two different environments. Twins of both varieties, so twins, monozygotic and dizygotic twins, raised together and raised apart. In the case of one twin, for example, being put up for adoption. And I want you to take a minute to look at these numbers. So the higher the number, that indicates a greater relationship between how closely each of the twins share that particular personality trait. So the greater the number, the greater the closeness in personality traits. Okay, so this is twins reared together, and this is identical twins versus fraternal twins, and this is twins reared apart, identical twins versus fraternal twins. So take a minute to kind of study this table. And when you had a minute to examine the numbers closely, you'll learn one of three things. First, genes, as mentioned before, seem to contribute significantly to people's personality. So if we go back here, that is, when people share more genes, in the case of identical twins, for example, their personalities tend to be more similar than those twins that share less of the genes, so fraternal twins. That is to say, genes contribute to people's personality in a significant way. The other thing to note, as I noted earlier, even when there is a perfect degree of overlap between genes of identical twins, for example, the numbers are considerably less than the perfect correlation coefficient of 1, meaning environment matters. Here's the third and final lesson that we get from these types of studies about personality. The final lesson is that non-shared environmental factors, that is, environments that are unique to each twin. As mentioned earlier, let's say one twin had a particularly close relationship with a peer in their adolescent years. So that would be considered a non-shared environmental factor. So non-shared environmental factors tend to matter more than shared inputs in shaping our personality. And shared environmental inputs here, as an example, what kind of parenting style that the two twins were exposed to. So non-shared environments are more important than shared ones in personality. And I want you to maybe think of a few examples of what you consider non-shared environmental factors that may, in fact, contribute to personality development. So what other non-shared factors could there be? Work by Soloway showed us that birth order, or whether you're first, middle, or last born of a child of a family, for example, may be one of those non-shared environmental factors. However, the research doesn't really back that idea up entirely. That is, the research does not support the link between personality and order of birth. With the exception of one interesting finding, Soloway's studies showed that later-born children were more accepting of radical scientific ideas on average, again, typically. So we're leaving the biological approach to understanding personality behind for now, and now we focus on the 5 conceptualizations of personality arising from the 5 schools of thought in psychology, which were introduced in the beginning of this course. So the first school of thought that we discussed was the psychoanalytic school of thought. And Sigmund Freud, who is, of course, the father of psychoanalysis, was one of the first people in psychology to propose a coherent theory of personality. Freud was born in Vienna and stands as one of the most influential, famous or infamous, if you will, influential psychologists of all time. And love him or hate him, Freud really did help popularize psychology. His interest in psychology was evident really early on in his training. Freud was very much fascinated by the work of Charcot, who was a French neurologist specializing in helping patients, mostly women, suffering from a condition that was called at the time hysteria. And hysteria is similar to a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5 condition, which is the compendium of all the psychological disorders out there. So hysteria is similar to the DSM-5 condition, what we call conversion disorder, which is defined as the experience of physiological symptoms, such as neurological symptoms like paralysis of one limb, for example. So the experience of these neurological symptoms for which there is no organic or physical reason at all for why they're experiencing it. Hysteria is directly translated as the wandering womb, and that's why the condition was mostly believed to only affect women. So Charcot used hypnosis in his assessment and treatment of this condition, hysteria. And here's a depiction of Charcot using hypnosis to treat a woman believed, so this is Charcot here, this is that woman believed to suffer from hysteria. And the lecture is given in an educational setting where other physicians and neurologists are observing. So early on in his career, Freud applied and was accepted to do a year-long internship with Charcot. And that's really where his interest deepened for psychology and personality. At its core, Freudian psychoanalysis has 3 core assumptions. First, an assumption called psychic determinism, which suggests that all our behavior is out of our volitional control. Instead, every action or inaction, if you will, is determined by unconscious conflicts and forces that are outside of our control. That is, we are not really free to choose our actions. The second assumption, namely symbolic meaning, suggests that all our behaviors and all psychological events we experience, such as thoughts, for example, have a hidden meaning behind them. It is the job of the psychoanalyst to help patients, for example, uncover the meaning behind their behaviors or some of the thoughts that they experience. The third assumption, something called unconscious motivation, which suggests that not only do we not have control over our actions and thoughts, that we are largely unaware of why we do the things that we do. The forces that drive our behavior are well below our conscious awareness. Freud suggested that personality was made up of 3 distinct parts. And the large majority of these parts are operating in the unconscious without our conscious awareness. So this is his conceptualization. So the line here is the line separating the unconscious from the conscious. And the majority of personality, which is represented by this iceberg, the majority of personality resides in the unconscious parts of our psyche. So only a small segment of some of these parts is present in the conscious level. The 3 parts of personality, according to psychoanalysis, are the id, ego, and the superego, and each has a function in our personality. The id is the oldest part of our personality and represents the primitive desires that we all have, desires for sex, violence, etc. This segment of personality is completely submerged in the unconscious and gives rise to a lot of what we do. The id also operates according to something that Freud called the pleasure principle, meaning it strives for immediate gratification all the time. The id operates through several several specific drives, such as the sex drive, or what Freud called the libido, which basically propels people to seek certain pleasures, for example. That is, the id wants gratification no matter how socially inappropriate or unfeasible the attainment of that gratification would be. Of course, we learn very quickly in our childhood that the pursuit of immediate gratification is at best not effective and at worst super socially inappropriate. So another part of personality starts to develop, and that's called the superego. The superego is the moral and ethical answer to the id. It gives us our sense of morality and what is right versus what is wrong. Superego directly translates to above I. As mentioned, id operates according to the pleasure principle. Superego, on the other hand, operates according to the morality principle. According to Freud, we develop our superego in accordance with parental and societal rules. With that all said, of course, and given the very high moral standards that the superego operates at, the standards set by the superego are often very much unattainable. And for this reason, something else happens. Another part of personality starts to blossom. The third and final part of our personality is ego, and that starts to develop shortly after the development of the superego. Excuse me. And the ego operates according to the reality principle. And so it acts as kind of a negotiator or a mediator, if you will, between the other two parts of personality, the id and the superego. It wants to bring the id the pleasures that it so strives for, and also do so in a socially and a morally appropriate way. So it helps the id delay some of its gratifications, if you will, for times when it's more appropriate, more socially sanctioned, if you will. Excuse me again. So for the most part, the three parts work together very well. So the ego, superego, and ego, the ego, id, and the superego all work together fairly harmoniously or fairly well. But according to Freud and other psychoanalysts, sometimes the three parts are in conflict. And when these conflicts bubble up, sometimes they bubble up and they surface in conscious awareness in the form of a psychological disorder or a certain symptom of a psychological disorder. When there is conflict between the three parts of personality, the person often experiences a lot of distress. So basically, it's the job of the patient, with the help of the psychoanalyst, to get at the bottom of this unconscious conflict, if you will, and to understand that these conflicts are arising from somewhere. And the clearer the picture, at least this is the psychoanalytic view, the clearer the picture we get of these unconscious conflicts, the less the symptoms that we are going to experience. So how do we figure out something that we can't see or we can't touch? How do we know what kind of conflicts are going on in the unconscious, which is by definition intangible? You can't see it. It's unconscious. You can't measure it. You can't monitor it. So according to Freud and other psychoanalysts, dreams represent the theater upon which unconscious conflicts are actually played out. So in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, dream interpretation is one of the main approaches. When you get a chance, click on the link embedded in the slides here, which is this one right here. And this is going to be a fun little database that provides some psychoanalytic style interpretation of themes that happen to reoccur in people's dreams. So if you have some time, have some fun with it maybe. So the ego has a big job to do. Not only does it work as a mediator between the rowdy two other parts, it works tirelessly, basically, to help keep the conflict between the id and the superego from bubbling up to the surface. And this is to avoid undue distress of the person. So the ego tries to protect you from that distress and tries to mask some of the conflicts as they bubble up to the surface. So the ego sometimes changes your perception of the outside world in order to keep all signs of conflict at bay. The ego creates what psychoanalysts call defense mechanisms to do this. So these are kind of unconscious maneuvers that are designed very specifically to help people alleviate some anxieties and tensions that would otherwise emerge if they knew the sources of the conflicts. And here's a table of psychoanalytically based defense mechanisms. For example, the defense mechanism of repression. This one right here. Or when you repress or push down a disturbing thought or memory, again, it works to keep away thoughts and memories that are going to bring you some discomfort. So you repress them, you push them deep inside in the subconscious or the unconscious. Projection is another defense mechanism, which is this one right here. And projection is basically another defense mechanism. And this is when you attribute your own socially unacceptable thoughts and motives to someone else, as if you're projecting your discomforts onto someone else, for example. Sublimation is a more positive form of a defense mechanism, if you will. And this is when you transform a basic id impulse, so let's say an impulse for aggression, for example, into something more socially accepted, such as turning your id impulse of aggression into some kind of art or music piece. So that's what sublimation is. There are other defense mechanisms, of course. And excuse me, I have been quite sick lately. Such as rationalization. So rationalization is another defense mechanism, and this is when you try to explain away your own unreasonable behavior in a way that sounds logical or rational. So, I did this, that, or the other thing because I was feeling lonely at the time, so it makes sense. Reaction formation is another defense mechanism. It's actually one of the few defense mechanisms that have some empirical or research support behind them. And reaction formation is when you turn an anxiety-provoking thought or motive into the exact opposite of it. So if you fear being gay, for example, you display opposite type of behavior. So you become very homophobic and outwardly an opposition of gay rights. Research has actually shown that male college students that showed there was a correlation between basically their homophobic tendencies and their penile response in reaction to viewing gay pornography. So that's an interesting piece of research support that is present for the concept of reaction formation. It's very rare that there is something from psychoanalysis that is empirically shown to be supported, and that is one of them. So Freud believed personality develops really early on in childhood, and in fact he believed most of personality pretty much completely developed by the age of 5. And he talked about personality development as progressing through various stages. He called this the stages of psychosexual development. Freud believed that sexuality was very much central to personality development. So he believed sexuality was a factor even in infancy, believe it or not. He named the various stages of his personality development after erogenous zones in the body: oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. Here are the 5 stages of psychosexual development. The oral stage, which is beginning from this one here, beginning from birth all the way to the genital stage, which begins at the age of 12 and goes beyond. And Freud believed that the majority of personality development is pretty much over and done with by the time the phallic stage is set. or basically within the first 5 or 6 years of life. As mentioned, all of the stages are named after erogenous zones in the body and all relate to some sort of or source of sexual pleasure, if you will. Oral stage derives sexual pleasure mainly from sucking and drinking. Anal stage from expelling of feces or holding in feces. Freud believed that healthy personality development moves seamlessly between various stages. However, the person does not appropriately, when the person doesn't appropriately solve a particular developmental problem associated with a particular stage, the person can actually get stuck or fixated in a particular stage of psychosexual development. So if you're stuck in the oral stage of psychosexual development, this can cause later problems in adulthood, according to Freud, that relate to unhealthy oral habits. For example, overeating or smoking or indulging in drinking or something of that nature. So if you get stuck in the oral stage, you develop some kind of an oral-related bad habit later on in adulthood. And if you get stuck in the second stage, for example, which is the anal stage, which happens anywhere from 18 months to 3 years of age, that could prove some difficulties in adulthood surrounding perfectionism and your tendency to be rigid, what Freud called anal retentive personalities. According to Freud, the phallic stage, which happens anywhere from 3 to 6 years of life, is the most important stage of personality development. It's the time of a storm, if you will, and relates to children becoming interested in their genitals, according to Freud. One of the most controversial claims Freud made about the phallic stage is that during this stage of psychosexual development, Freud believed that children started developing sexual attraction to the opposite sex parent. So boys would have a sexual attraction towards their mothers and girls towards their fathers. During the phallic stage, boys, according to Freud, developed the Oedipus complex, which is a sexual attraction to the mother and a resentment towards the father. It was named after a Greek play in which Oedipus, unbeknownst unto him, actually falls in love with his mother and then murders his father for the love of his mother. Alternatively, Freud also believed that girls during the phallic stage started developing what he called the Electra complex, where the girl develops an attraction towards the father, apparently, and starts resenting the mother, who the girl believes has castrated her. So the girl, according to Freud, develops penis envy. The appropriate resolution of this very stormy phallic stage, according to Freud, is through the repression of the sexual attraction that you have towards the opposite sex parent, and through feeling of alignment, if you will, with the same-sex parent. Latency stage happens anywhere from age of 6 to about 12, is when things start calming down a lot more. Okay, so the phallic stage is, there's a lot going on. Oedipus complex, Electra complex. The latency stage is when things slow down a little bit, and according to Freud, impulses at that particular stage are sublimated. And if you remember what sublimation is, it's when you channel something into more appropriate interests. So this is the school age, if you will, and so children learn to channel id impulses into school and other scholarly achievements, if you will. Then children typically enter the genital stage, which sees a reawakening of the child's sexual interest, but at this time, the sexual interests are for appropriate objects. So this marks the beginning of romantic exploration, according to Freud. So, all in all, a lot could be said about Freudian theory of personality. Freud almost single-handedly put psychology on the map. His theory is very influential and has become part of pop culture. I mean, think about it. I'm sure you know the term Freudian slip, which actually comes from the concept of psychic meaning, that even slips of the tongue, calling a professor mom, for example, accidentally. According to Freud, this has some kind of a psychic meaning behind it. So even references in pop culture, references of Freudian psychoanalysis are pretty ubiquitous. With that all said, though, his theory is not, and obviously not without its criticism, because many of the claims made are made about the existence of something called the unconscious, and by definition, the unconscious is something that's very difficult to access. Many claims made by Freud are simply unfalsifiable, so they cannot be tested empirically. How do you test the unconscious, for example? How do you measure that? Further, and from the stuff that we did try and test, there have been many failed replications, and many psychologists have even questioned the existence of this thing called the unconscious, which is obviously very central to Freudian theory. More so, Freud's theories were mostly based on clients who used to come to him for therapy, and oftentimes, by far the majority of people who used to come to him for therapy were actually highly affluent women of that time. Therefore, his theory may not actually be representative of the larger population, because the larger population is not made up of affluent women. Finally, and as we know from twin and adoption studies, shared environmental inputs matter less in shaping our personality than unique or non-shared environmental inputs. Yet Freud really emphasized the role of shared environments in his theory. And he emphasized things like parenting, etc., as a major force on personality, when we know, in fact, that these types of shared environmental inputs matter less in shaping personality. Until next time.